Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the sixth and final episode in our Climate Justice Charter Movement webinar series. We have, over the past 10 weeks, had 5 webinars. This is the sixth one in this series, all addressing the climate crisis here in South Africa. This evening's webinar is themed on labor, climate justice, and the rural water crisis. Into that, what exactly is the Climate Justice Charter movement? It's a loose collection of many grassroots organizations that came together to draft the Climate Justice Charter, which was adopted last year in October. We've also delivered the charter to Parliament. We're running a petition at the moment to gather support for our charter, so we'd ask you to sign the petition either as an individual or as an organization. That link will be placed in the chat. The Climate Justice Charter is our plan to end hunger, thirst, pollution, and climate breakdown in South Africa. It's an ability to move away from relying on large corporations and various forms of climate breakdown toward a people-led eco-socialist alternative for all forms of living, including water and labor, which we'll be addressing today. It's about climate justice, it's about ecological justice, it's about social justice, and it's about intergenerational justice. We're excited to welcome you into our movement and for these conversations we've been having about the Climate Justice Charter. So today we've got a very interesting intersection between labor, between water, and climate justice. So to give you some background, I just want to read 2 sections from the Climate Justice Charter themed on the water commons and on labor. So when we list the alternatives, sustainable alternatives to the way that the system's currently running, that's in the 4th section of our chapter. So 4.4 is titled Democratize the Water Commons. And here the charter says, water is controlled by a few, while many are in desperate need. Industrial farms, mines, coal-generated electricity, sugar, and timber plantations are some of the major users of water. As a public good, water needs to be conserved by all, and it must be protected from pollution. Furthermore, water use has to be democratically planned and effectively regulated while affirming citizens' rights to consume this scarce and precious resource. Water and sanitation infrastructure must be upgraded, managed, and monitored to ensure efficient use. Water savings from phasing out coal generation and big industrial scale farming will enhance the water commons. A water conscious society has to be promoted. So that's the general framework of water commons alternative to the current very privatized system, and a system that leads to water shortages and people not having access to water, especially in rural communities. The section right after that, 4.5, speaks a bit about labor, and it's titled Enjoy Life Through Working Less. And here the charter says, work for everyone as the means to survive and earn income is no longer possible. Unemployment, low-paying jobs, and long working hours harm society. In a heating world, working hours must be reduced, at least to a 4-day week. Decent zero-carbon climate jobs must be guaranteed and supported by collective, values-based and eco-centric approaches to production, consumption, financing, and ways of living through the solidarity economy. Such an economy is based on needs and democratizes economic power, together with a universal basic income grant system, UBIG, complementing existing public goods. All workers can be protected in the transition required, and society more generally will have a cushion. The UBIG will generally promote human cultural flourishing in a post-work society. And you can find out more about this, including policies such as the UBIG, by following the Climate Justice Charter movement online, CJ Charter SA on Twitter. You can follow the Cooperative Policy and Alternative Center, COPAC, on Facebook and on the YouTube channel, where we also post recordings of the previous webinar and where we will post this webinar. Before I introduce our guest this evening, I ask everyone to really think about the conversation we're going to have this evening, draft some questions, and about at the half-hour mark, I'm going to open up for public engagement where you can just put your questions in the chat and I will address it to our discussant. Today, we're going to be joined by Haminda Didat, the Executive Director of NALEDI. That's the National Labor and Economic Development Institute. NALEDI was formed in 1993 and carries out labor and economic research. Its mission is to conduct policy-relevant research aimed at building the capacity of the labor movement to effectively engage with the challenges of the new South African society. And of course, today we're talking about a South African society that has been devastated by climate shocks, by a lack of access to water in rural communities. And so it is very crucial that labor movements are able to address these and other issues. Good evening, Hamida. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good evening, Tishimo, and good evening to all the uh, participants who've joined the seminar.
Thank you so much. And I suppose the first and most important question is for us to understand why South Africa is in a rural water crisis. Where does this come from?
Okay, so I think there's two issues, and I must warn you, water is my passion, so I can go on and on and on and on till tomorrow. So you're gonna have to just be. I think at certain points you just need to flag for me when you feel that a particular topic has been covered. I think. Look, I mean, if you take away, if you want to address your question, the first one is we can talk about operation maintenance skills in the water sector capacity, and that's a man-made problem. Not that climate change isn't, but I think in terms of where you could actually physically go and change, well, I suppose you can apply the same to the issue of climate change, but you don't have the control over a drought in the same way that you have control of operation maintenance. So if I give you the landscape of the South African water sector, I mean, I've been involved for more than 20 years in the water sector and specifically in terms of water services. And my sense is that South Africa has some of the most amazing regulations, legislation, policies in relation to how to run water services, how to do integrated water resource management, how to manage your rivers, your dams, the issues around rainwater harvesting. So we've got all of that. The problem is due to poor governance on the parts of both local government as well as on the part of the Department of Water Affairs in particular. And despite the fact that water is also a public good and is seen to fit within the Department of Environmental Affairs, it's the services aspect and the integrated water resource management aspect sits within the Department of Water Affairs, and they are basically the custodians. And unfortunately, over the last 10 to 15 years, they have failed us in the most dramatic way to uphold their custodianship. I think several ministers, particularly after Minister Sinjika, probably don't have a good idea of what it is that they're supposed to be doing. I still don't think that the current minister is on par with what her role and responsibilities are as a custodian of our water resources and how it needs to be managed. So there's an infrastructure problem and skills and capacity, and that in and of itself is a seminar all on its own. If you then bring it home to the particular issue that we're looking at in terms of our climate change, we know that in if you take the current context, so over the last 3 to 4 years, climate change has become a major reality for many South Africans. And not that it hasn't been a reality before, but I think when you actually struggle with access to water, not because you can't afford it, but simply because the taps run dry, or because municipalities institute mechanisms which would come into being as a result of a context when they find themselves within the context of drought, you then become astutely aware of the fact that something has changed. So we know, I think in 2015, 2016, I think out of the 9 provinces, 7 provinces were experiencing a drought, the Northern Cape in particular. And then all of a sudden, in that same context, while the Eastern Cape and the Northern Cape continued to have their droughts, we then saw sporadic rainfalls, particularly in KZN. We saw massive amounts of rain in Cape Town. And then you'd find completely the opposite, where there were massive, waves reaching high proportions, covering half of Sea Point, dams being filled, torrents of water just being, rushed down, drains being filled because it hasn't been properly maintained. So we saw a mix of drought with major water scarcities, and then we saw these torrents of rainfalls in different parts of the country. I mean, with I think over the last, I think it was 2 years ago, um, the issue around the city of Cape Town's drought probably put a lot of the issue around climate change and people's access to water into perspective. But and I think while the issue that they raised, had some sort of merit, I think that the actual emphasis should have been on the Eastern Cape. When we look at the extent to which the communities, rural communities in particular in the Eastern Cape, the fact that the dam didn't have a percentage, but it was actually on zero. I mean, you had sand beds of a dam that was actually providing water, not just to animals and to agriculture, but specifically to people. So we became astutely aware of the consequences, and I think the Eastern Cape has just recently started to recover in some ways from that. So I think, to answer your question, there's a combination, and obviously, if you do not have the proper infrastructure, you do not do proper operation and maintenance. In fact, I just finished on a webinar this morning with the Water Research Commission. And again, while unaccounted for water, meaning water that's lost through infrastructure, particularly water services infrastructure, it's always been in the region of about 70%, and which is very, very high for South Africa, despite the fact that there are skills and there are policies that and engineers, as well as consultancy firms, that are supposed to be addressing the issues of unaccounted for water or water losses. We still find that as a result of poor operation and maintenance, water, which is an absolutely precious resource, is being left to run down the drain as a result of inefficiencies and infrastructural challenges related to poor operation and maintenance. So in a nutshell, I would say that those are some of the challenges.
I hear all of this, Hamida, and I'm sure a lot of us attending this webinar are quite distraught at the scope of the challenge in South Africa. So hearing these issues, one can only wonder what government's responses have been. Have we tracked government's responses over the years, both to the infrastructural and mismanagement issues, and now the additional climate crisis issue, and also the fact that there's a massive neglect in rural communities? So a lot of public attention maybe for Cape Town Day Zero, but not a lot of attention for the everyday day zeros in rural communities. So over time, how has the government responded to both inadequacies, the climate crisis, and then the rural issue in particular?
Look, I mean, I think that your question is exceptionally loaded, and the difficulty to give you one answer is by virtue of the fact that we have different provinces with different demographics, different municipalities with different economies of scale, and then when you talk about the money that's available for the municipality to actually address the issues, it would vary. So if you take and I hate the example because I'm not 100% convinced that the city of Cape Town actually had a water crisis to the extent that they made it out to be. And that's precisely because they had other water resources, such as underground water, the aquifers, that they could have tapped into. There was also massive amounts of unaccounted for water that they were not actually properly maintaining. But be that as it may, because the city of Cape Town had infrastructure, have the necessary resources, they went on a massive campaign. They instituted drought tariffs. They put in mechanisms of water demand management devices, and so in their way, they believe that they addressed the so-called climate crisis by mitigating and ensuring that there was limited water use, and in that way we were able to survive. If you take the issues of the Eastern Cape or the Northern Cape, for that matter, and particularly our rural communities, even Limpopo, I mean, the municipalities do not have at their disposal this kind of resources. They don't have the publicity or media campaign with the money that the city of Cape Town had in order to talk about a day zero and do the whole dramaticism. The reality is, and I think you pointed out quite adequately and I think succinctly and absolutely correctly, is that while we've got urban municipalities accessing water, and while we've got municipalities accessing water, and people in urban municipalities being able to access water, we have a reality in South Africa, particularly in rural communities, where people still do not have access to water. And this is an absolute and utter indictment. So if you take the Limpopo province, and I did a keynote speak for the HSRC in November last year. I mean, it's shocking, and I mean, I'm a water researcher. I've been out of the sector for a bit, noting the fact that I'm doing a lot of work with a strong labor perspective across different sectors. So I haven't been able to actually engage on the issues of water to the extent that I would love to. But just from the couple of months, having been re-engaged into the sector, You've got dams that are built next to poor communities where the water is running to your industry. And the historically disadvantaged and black communities of South Africa, particularly in rural and poorly disadvantaged communities, still do not have access to free basic water, let alone water from a tap, which is potable water, or a flush toilet. I mean, this is frightening. If you talk about sanitation, I remember, I think almost 10 years ago, I attended an HSS, sorry, it was the Human Rights Commission hearings, where one of the first children, who was about 6 years old, had fallen and drowned in a pit latrine. And the sad part, I think it's the most disheartening, is that this incident has not stopped. You still hear of children falling and drowning in pit latrines, and there's no accountability. There's no lawsuit being taken. I think even when I was doing research in one of the municipalities in the Eastern Cape, due to contamination of groundwater, and the boreholes were actually, so groundwater becomes a source for borehole, becomes a borehole, and then the borehole becomes a source of water supply for particularly rural communities. In this particular municipality, the municipality did not distinguish um, whether the borehole was being used for animals or whether it was being used for human consumption. And there was major contamination, and babies died. I think 8 babies died from drinking that water. Now, this might be historical, but I can guarantee you that if we go through a lot of the research, empirical research in terms of what's happening in the rural communities, horrific stories will arise. I mean, I know in one of the question, when you walk and you look at children taking water out of a drain, you cannot believe that in the context of South Africa, that this and where we fought for a democratic country with a constitution that enshrines the right to water, that we have people and historically black people who previously marginalized, water services and services in general were used as an apartheid mechanism. It's just frightening. I think if you go to Mpumalanga, apart from the fact that Eskom is given so much of rights, or the same with the mines, where the water licenses, the manner in which they use the water, the manner in which they're able to pollute the water with a free license, is an indictment. But most importantly, if you go into the communities surrounding Eskom and the mines, you find raw sewage running into the street, while the same community who are having to deal with the raw sewage running into their streets do not have access to water, because the mall that's a couple of kilometers away has been given the right to water infrastructure, and because the infrastructure and the pressure system works much better than the rural or the small urban town. The moment people are flushing toilets or all of the taps are open in the mall, the people in the community have no water.
And I
So
want to
and that's
actually,
compounded with a community with the health issues related to that. So I think the situation in our country, both from a water services perspective, and please don't let me even go onto the issues of dams and the levels of
yes,
sewage in the
but
dams.
I
I
would
mean,
actually like you.
it's an absolute indictment. You just have to look for those. I can't remember the name of the flowers, but
Mm.
they look so pretty. But the moment you see them, oh my God, it's pollution. I mean, look at
I,
Hartbeespoort Dam.
Hamida, I actually
You
do want
can't
you
go
to
past the dams
perhaps.
without seeing these horrible. I mean, I don't have a problem with vegetation, but usually it's supposed to be your water, your waterblommetjies, your water, the water, the lovely
Mhm.
lilies. But and even when you look at the fish and the species in the water, they have substantively changed. And what people don't realize in terms of our water services is that's the water from which our actual drinking water is being abstracted. So just to give you an anecdote, there was a time when I was doing work with the Water Research Commission, and there was a particular process called SANS 241, which is the South African National Standards for Drinking Water Quality. We had to look at, so the way in which the SANS 241 works is that you would have different standards against which you would test for different municipalities, because there's different industries, and the different industries discharge certain waste material into the rivers. And if that river is yours, or is your source of abstraction towards your water plant, you would have to test against the specific chemicals that you believe are discharged in the water. So therefore, it would vary. So where there's no mines, you wouldn't be testing for the high levels of chemical content. So when I was doing this particular piece of research around reclamation of wastewater, and I'll talk a little bit more about that under the climate change and how we can take the issues forward,
Yes,
I
yes.
picked up the issue around the water safety. So and then prompted a research project by the Water Research Commission to review the SANS 241, which is the South African National Standards for Drinking Water Quality. And that meant that they had to review what was actually going into the water. So to give you an example, if you go on ARVs, if you're taking antibiotics, at the moment people are getting the J&J vaccine, people are taking different forms of medication that eventually enter the wastewater treatment system and eventually go back into the river. So if the SANS 241, which is the standard, does not have that particular chemical in its list of what it's testing for when you do your purifying process for water, then in actual fact you'll be drinking the water with those particular chemicals, even though the water had gone through a purification process. What's even
Yeah.
scarier is that I think over the last probably 5 years, and I'm open to correction, but more or less 5 years, the SANS 241 is not being applied. So we had a blue drop and a green drop process. Every municipality was required to do a SANS 241. They had to send their water to labs. The lab tests had to go to the department. That was a part of regulations. And then on the basis of that, you would then know that the water was safe. And and then from a regulatory perspective, the Department of Water Affairs would on a month-to-month basis keep a track of this. And at the end of the 12 months, they would probably issue a blue drop to every single municipality that was compliant for 12 months, which meant that people were able to drink their water. If the water was not compliant, you then had to give out a drinking water notice to make communities know that the water is actually unsafe. I saw a notice from two different municipalities within this, sorry, two different municipal offices within the Western Cape jurisdiction, where the water quality was an issue, and they did not issue a drinking water quality notice. We do not have SANS 241. There isn't drinking water quality nor wastewater quality control. So the problem is, even in terms of the quality of the service that we're currently getting, it's a major challenge. And I think we, as South African citizens coming from an apartheid state, coming into a constitution that guarantees us rights, guarantees our health, right to drinking water and what's the greatest indictment is South Africa used to have the best drinking water quality in the world. You could open the tap across the country, wherever you were, and you could drink it. We've gone backwards. And,
So, Hamida, I just want to, thank you for spotlighting many issues here. The fact that part of what creates the rural water crisis is siphoning water away from rural communities for malls, for other large corporations, infrastructure, wealthier communities in urban areas, highlighting as well the human cost of the water crisis in terms of the safety of the water people are consuming, contamination, water pollution, and various crises that affect the environment to which people live within, and then also highlighting as well the inadequacies of many governments. And I would agree with you that it's a really complex thing to analyze government as one concept, given the different responsibilities at local and provincial level. But I was wondering if we could steer toward the kind of communities that are rising up against the water crisis in ways that are perhaps more positive or leads toward the kind of future state we want to live in. So I just want to hear from you in what ways organizations like your own doing research, but then also labor movements and even communities are rising up against this water crisis and trying to find ways to create a water commons or some kind of pro-poor alternative to the current water management system.
okay, so I must be honest. I mean, currently, I'm not actually able to. I haven't done research on current contestation. I know that in the news there's been service protests, but just to give you an example maybe to cite an example that I didn't do research on, but one that one of the union representatives raised this morning in the meeting I was in. The comrade indicated that the Department of Water and Sanitation wants to bring in, I think, 25 Cuban engineers, whom they argue would be able to transfer skills to South Africans, and on that basis improve the water services. And there's quite a big issue in relation to the amount of money that they're willing to pay, um, the Cuban engineers. And the point that the comrade then made was, well, this is what South Africa what the Department of Water Affairs is planning to do, because they believe that there needs to be, or there's a skills gap, and this is how they want to address the skills gap. But then he gave a very interesting example of Sunnyhof. And he said in this particular municipality, there were challenges with the wastewater treatment plant. In fact, the municipality in and of itself, just generally in terms of services, has just let down the community in a very bad way. So there was a particular plumber who worked, I assume, within local government, within that municipality. And despite being a plumber by profession, had obviously managed to understand, through his own on-site learning and experiential learning, how to actually manage a wastewater and a water quality treatment plant. So the water treatment plant and the water treatment plant, he was actually able to manage, and actually provided people with clean drinking water. The municipality refused to accept the inefficiencies and took the plumber and the community to court and won. Within 2 days of that particular system and that plumber being removed, the water went back to scratch. So sometimes, one has to question, the law in South Africa, as I indicated from the beginning, absolutely brilliant. But the unintended consequences that sometimes comes from our law, which is supposed to protect, provide, enshrine rights, leads to our detriment.
Yeah.
I can some of my own personal experiences in terms of how people have challenged the department and some of the work that I've done was we used the regulations. So the Department of Water Affairs was developing a regulatory framework on how you regulate the water and water services and water resources. And because we were at that time quite a strong civil society network linked up with Labour, somewhere in particular, plus the Anti-Privatization Forum and the PD Concerned Citizens and so on, we pushed quite a strong, we were quite a formidable front. And as a result of that, we moved the direction of regulation to being one from economic regulation to one of social regulation. So there was a combination between economic and social, and we insisted that within the regulatory framing for the department around water services and water resources, you had to respect every single person, whether you were born in South Africa or not, as a citizen. So we changed the language substantively from consumer to citizen, and as a result of that, it imbued rights. We then use the regulations in relation to citizens' rights to contest water demand management devices, punitive measures by municipalities to use a drip system, to concurrently use the assurance of supply levy in conjunction with a prepaid meter. I was instrumental in actually getting the court case, the Mazibuko court case, which was of the pretty concerned citizens to challenge the prepaid water system. So there were those struggles, and I think even in terms of highlighting, for example, the worst drought, the worst impact of prepaid meters in drought-stricken Madlebe in KZN, and how under a newly democratic ANC government, as a result of going for cost recovery with rural communities, you actually had the worst cholera outbreak that you had in the history of South Africa as a result of really punitive measures and commodification of water services and resources, as opposed to actually realizing people's rights. So unfortunately, I'm really sorry, I cannot speak to the most current, but I would be exceptionally delighted if you're saying that people are finally taking up the struggle. I know when I did the research, when I did the input in Limpopo, people were raising very, very strongly, how there was mismanagement, there was money that was directed towards infrastructure. It took several years before the contractor was actually contracted. Then the infrastructure went halfway. To date, all the money that the municipality has spent to develop the infrastructure to provide and improve water access has not been realized, despite the fact that the money has basically gone down the drain. Nobody's being held accountable. So again, I think I would be really delighted if, and I think when you open up for discussion, if there are comrades who know of really strong civil protests against what I think is an absolute indictment. In fact, water is life. So when you're providing people or not providing people with water, of proper quality. It's an attempted murder. And I think we have a constitution that enshrines our rights. We have regulations, we have legislation. And if you look at the failure on the part of local government, probably across our country, we as citizens have the right to really become advocates for enshrining those rights and realizing them in a way that I think we're currently not doing. I don't know whether it's the ethos of this particular era, and how protests are taken forward. But definitely
It
in the
sounds like, Hamida, when we come together, there's much that we can achieve, especially building on from that first shift, moving away from an economic conception of water and seeing people as consumers toward citizens or actual people who have water as a need enshrined in Section 27 of our Constitution. I suppose a lot of these organizations also played a pivotal role in even developing the Climate Justice Charter as well. We actually are opening up for conversation and discussion right now. If you have a question for Hamida, just write it in the chat and then we will ask it to Hamida and have a short little conversation about that. Whilst you draft your questions, I actually want to ask you about the Climate Justice Charter, Hamida. You wrote an article in the Daily Maverick talking about needing to speak out against the rural water crisis, and you opened it by speaking about the Climate Justice Charter and how you see it as a potential avenue for addressing a lot of the rural water crisis that we're facing in South Africa. I was wondering if you could go more into that. How does this charter help to address this massive issue that you've just highlighted in this webinar?
Sure. So let me be clear that maybe not to, and I don't mean any disrespect by it. The charter belongs to those of us who formulated it, and what it imbues is our vision, our aspirations, our hopes of an alternative world. And I think we're also calling out and quite rightly so, the injustices that South Africans and people all around the world, who particularly marginalized communities, are experiencing. So how a climate justice charter in and of itself can achieve that? No, I think the principles and bringing together civil society organizations, labor, people within academics, people within the department themselves, who feel quite passionate and who share the same passion that I do, and who are really committed to actually wanting to provide water for communities and take their role as custodians seriously. I think a combination of all of those stakeholders looking at the principles enshrined in the visions enshrined within the charter can use this as a vehicle, as a tool, in order to advocate for the vision and the world that we want to see, particularly in relation to water. So let's take the issue of water as a good. We know that, in terms of the neoliberal orientation towards water, despite the fact that there's a recognition that water is an environmental good, that it has environmental value, and when you talk about it as a good, we would argue from an anti-capitalist perspective that it is not commercial, it is not commodity, it shouldn't be commodified, privatized, and it remains a public good, and that is within the charter. So the charter provides fundamental principles and a basis from which one could argue and put forward very, very strongly alternatives to the current paradigm in which water resources as well as water services are being managed. I think, like I said, and I think the fact that the more people you get to rally around the charter, the more people who can identify with the values and the visions and the potential for realization of something that is an alternative through a rights-based approach. I think those are the things that the charter, that's how the charter can actually help us to realize the vision that we're wanting to see. I think you raised the issue in relation to labor. So the charter also gives voice and recognition to the environment, to human beings, as well as to, and when you talk about human beings, it's about the community as workers, and there's a distinction made quite succinctly within the charter. And that speaks to, for example, from a labor perspective, because that's the space I'm coming from at the moment, it speaks to our ideal principle of a just transition. So we would, when we talk about, and just to give you an example, currently the water services space, in the context of climate change and scarce water resources, scarce not because of mismanagement, but scarce as a result of a drought, which is as a result of climate change. If you're wanting to manage that water resource, you can have a process called reclamation. So reclamation is where you take the wastewater and you treat it up to a really high standard, to the point that you can drink it again. So it's from source to tap, but it's an entire circle. So there's not a single drop that's wasted, but you're also ensuring that you're managing your water resources in an absolutely efficient way. Singapore is a perfect example. They've got the most pristine wastewater treatment plant, and in fact, they use it as a tourist destination. If you walk over the wastewater treatment plant, you would not believe that that was actually wastewater that was turned into drinking water. But most importantly, the wastewater is, because of the contaminants within the water, it's treated to such a high standard that it is actually much purer than your actual drinking water quality. And the other thing that I must mention again, just to come to people that are listening, is that it's not as if the water that we're drinking currently has not been reclaimed. So a portion of the water that we drink comes from the very river, and it's the very river that your water source, that your wastewater has been discharged into. So, the notion of actually, well, the water falls from the sky, it goes into a dam, it's completely clean, or it's almost, it's just contaminated from the fact that it's standing and then it gets purified. There's no such thing. Reclamation is an important part of the drinking water quality control system and process for us to be drinking water. But again, the notion of actually taking wastewater and reclaiming it, I think in the context of climate change, is absolutely important. And I think we need to be thinking about that in the same way that we're talking about a circular economy or a green economy, and in terms of achieving a just transition perspective, and the kinds of jobs that can be recreated, both in relation to water resource management, but also addressing the issues about water leaks and all of the challenges that I raised in the water sector. I think even if you look at the issue of how does one control, or how do you manage your water resource in the context of rainwater, Namibia is one of the leading countries where they've actually taken, they do you do a calculation on the river in terms of, well, if the river or the dam that is collecting the water has and specifically this would be in the context of a river, you more or less, I mean, there's enough data that gets calculated in terms of how much of rainfall a river would get, and sometimes the rain is more, sometimes the rain is less. But what people who are managing, doing integrated water resource management do, is they calculate what the actual river needs to sustain itself, and that's called the ecological reserve. Everything above that is usually taken out of the out of the river. Now, traditionally, that extra amount would go into a dam, and unfortunately, because of poor management, I would think, despite the fact that we have really innovative ways of capturing that water, a large part of it is evaporated. But if you use replenishing of your aquifer, you can actually calculate, well, how much needs to be evaporated, how much do you need for actual usage by your users, and then what percentage of that overrun can you actually put into your aquifer, so that if the following year or 3 years later you actually hit a drought, you don't actually have to struggle about where do I get the water from. You simply tap into your aquifer. Now, this was a discussion that I engaged with through a process with the Department of Water Affairs probably more than 15 or 20 years ago. I don't know of a single municipality that actually does replenishing of aquifers. So we can go into rainwater harvesting and how you can use rainwater harvesting to augment water services and water resources. You can talk about retrofitting. So the charter is a vehicle to advance the alternative forms of what I think is a colonialist form of water services at the moment in South Africa. And I think as the climate crisis worsens and as water becomes a challenge more and more so, we would be able to advance the kinds of visions that are within the charter, and hopefully through that process of running a lot more support for the charter, for the vision. And again, as you rightly said, we've taken it to Parliament, and I think as they start to confront these challenges, hopefully what we see as really visionary with, the charter is being really visionary, hopefully the penny will drop and we'll start seeing these kinds of shifts. It's not to say that the
Mm,
charter is the first time, that the charter is the only process or document that's mentioned this. I think through all the different pieces of research that I've done and a lot of other comrades like me, we've got the vision. I think what was wonderful about the charter is that it brings all of those visions and thoughts together into one space with a whole lot of organizations in South Africa and outside really endorsing it and
mm.
pushing for the vision. So really an important and insightful document.
I think you make a really good point there, Hamida, to move beyond the charter and into the various real material alternatives, reclamation, water aquifers, rainwater harvesting as well. It sounds there's a huge disconnect because there's already strong theoretical and practical frameworks and ideas for addressing water crises across South Africa, especially in rural communities. But as you mentioned, not a lot of municipalities or any municipalities you're aware of adopting this. So what I'm interested in hearing is how do we connect the two? What should a movement like ours do to ensure that municipalities adopt this? Is it a continual application of pressure? What methods have we been using currently to get municipal wide-scale adoption for these alternatives?
Look, I mean, at the moment, the really difficult question because you have to have a willing, almost like a willing recipient on the other end, um, to be open to discussion and open to change. Historically, as part of the South African Water Caucus and as a steering committee member, we were able to secure a meeting with the Minister of Water Affairs 4 times a year. The minister, even though it might be a he or a she, depending on who was elected, the ministers that were there had a commitment to understanding why water was important, and they understood their role as the custodians of our water resources. As a result, they engaged us, but they also recognized from a constitutional perspective the importance of citizens' participation. And that is why even in terms of the regulation, the citizens' voice was absolutely imperative. When you look at what local government was about, despite the fact that it was at a time when there was new demarcations, we were moving, and I'm talking about 1994 all the way through to maybe 2005, 2010, 2010. Major shifts in terms of demarcation, moving into cost recovery, certain aspects of institutional reform that moved towards privatization. But there was still a willingness and a recognition that there's citizens' voice, and communities were able to engage at different levels, but able to engage. The concept of engaging your citizenry, the possibility of accountability, transparency, and democracy, I think central principles have been lost. Our citizens and communities at the moment are struggling just on a day-to-day level to put bread on the table. So to become involved and vested in civil society organizations or community protests, or to be spending time towards advocacy around water access, unless the situation is absolutely dire, bread and butter becomes the key issue. So I think and then the other part that makes it, I think, even worse is that on the other end, with the the politics and the petty politics, who's listening? Do we see any traction if you go to a municipality and you say, well, you are supposed to have an IDP or a particular process where for example, at the moment, I think the city of Johannesburg is wanting to, as well as Tshwane, is wanting to increase the tariffs for all municipal services, probably double, right? We haven't even had notification to come to a public hearing to provide input to those, but there's already an announcement in the news, almost as if it is a done deal. Do we see the protest? Do we see the engagement? I believe that once these horrible tariffs start getting implemented, and if the municipality, due to their mismanagement, are trying to resolve their financial crisis by placing that responsibility or deferring their responsibilities rather onto the citizens, we are going to see protests. And there are going to be major protests around water and sanitation and electricity. And what it results in is people bypass prepaid water meters. There's going to be damage to infrastructure. There's going to be fires breaking out because people are going to reconnect electricity illegally. So you cannot, in a context of austerity and recession, where unemployment and poverty has risen astronomically, added to that the context of COVID. And I mean, if you just look at the health requirements under COVID, where people are supposed to be washing their hands and so on, how do you expect people to survive with doubling the tariffs? It makes absolutely no sense. So I'm of the, I mean, I'm very eager to see what the local government elections are going to look like and how many people are actually going to go and vote. But I think subsequent to that, as the tariffs start increasing and it starts to hit home, I think we're going to see a lot of action on the on the ground. And it's going to be quite interesting noting the fact that there will be national elections the following year. So yeah, quite a frightening scenario coming up, I think, in the next few months.
It does sound like you're narrating a government at different spheres that actually isn't trying to solve the water crisis, because if there are obvious solutions they're ignoring, but also the kind of actions you've characterized them as taking, water mitigation, increasing water tariffs, seems to be a government that is still sort of thinking about water as an economic good, as something that you shouldn't be providing to all people as some kind of right or need. I also wonder, Hamida, maybe in concluding remarks, I'm seeing not many questions from the public. These massive protests, community organization, if that can also be used as some kind of platform to convince the government that a water commons is what we need, that's something which is democratically controlled, not necessarily vested entirely in the whims of a municipality. You're mentioning the need for a willing recipient. So a system that doesn't rely on a centralized one person making decisions, for instance, the minister who we've been speaking about throughout this webinar, do we reopen? Do we start to move toward some kind of water commons? Do those massive protests that might arise also present this kind of opportunity to reform, the way we even manage water in South Africa?
So, sorry, I just want to link that up to this last question. Do you think, with the nature of our government being neoliberal, progressive engagement in terms of people before profits is possible? So, not in the current, definitely not in the current. And I would also say, Tshiamo, the difficulty is, even when we get to a worse crisis, because I think we are in a crisis, the problem is the people who are running the department do not see the crisis, or they don't care. But most important, and the Department of Water Affairs has consistently, I think, over the last 4 years, um, uh, received an unqualified audit. So there's major challenges. They're not managing the water correctly. And even when there's a crisis, okay, it's going to become a local government crisis, and it's going to create a platform for, let me tell you, exactly the alternative of the vision that we see. It's going to create the premise that privatization is the way to go, because the public sector and local government controlled by the public sector has failed. It is a failure in the public sector, and therefore the panacea to our pain is the private sector. We have been through processes since GEAR, with the introduction of neoliberalism, when the onslaught against us for privatization was at its height. Sadly, over the last almost 20 years, we've kind of lost momentum. Many activists have left the space, and we have, I think, in my view, there's been a conscious undermining of the public sector, coupled with the lack of operational maintenance, coupled by the issues of corruption, to such a point that it's feeding, and it will feed the perspective that the private sector is better. I think the only hope that I have for the moment is that historically, this is not only an issue that happened in South Africa. There are international examples of where countries in Latin America, for example, had gone through exactly the same process. Privatization was the answer. And as a result of the horrible experiences of privatization, there's been remunicipalization. One always says, hindsight is a good lesson. and somebody else's, if you can learn from somebody else's experience, and and miss out on the misfortune, then good for us. But unfortunately, with it, I think the question that Bertha is asking is actually a rhetorical one. With the government being who it is and making the kinds of neoliberal choices that it's making, nothing is going to move us from recession, from the austerity budget, nor the orientation of neoliberalism, until they go ahead and do their privatization, and it's going to fail. And we will go back, to starting the process again. And then at that point, I think the visions and the principles and bringing in civil society organization and let's work collectively and collaboratively, that would be the order of the day. But it's not going to happen. Not even if we all take to the street and we start marching. It's not going to stop the current agenda unless the entire country comes to a standstill. And I think in terms of where we're currently sitting, if you're looking at the spaces for contestation, if you're looking at the number of people that are actually engaging and participating in resistance, noting the current versus historically, we are exceptionally low. And I think, coming from a labor movement and from a labor movement perspective, COSATU as a leading federation of labor was historically was such a formidable organization. Neoliberalism and neoliberal policies, coupled with our own internal issues, has started to break us down. And we have our own challenges, and we are not at our strongest. And when you do not have a strong, united labor movement combined with a strong, active civil society movement, and as you say, the people of the commons pushing and advancing a really strong alternative position, we're not going to win it. So it's hard to say, but I don't want to sound despondent, but I want to leave people with words of inspiration, if I may, despite being pessimistic. I was once asked, I go to this protest and I go to that protest, and I'm trying to shift, dialogue, and I go to this meeting and I'm trying to argue with this minister and I'm trying to shift. Have I, in all of the years that I've engaged as an activist from a labor perspective or civil society, actually seen change? And my response to the person was, the world turns on its axis and it takes 365 days. And on the 1st of January every year, we celebrate that it's a new year. Have you felt the world turn? So that's how our change is. We will not see it in our lifetime, but we will be the agents of change that we want to see, so that if not our children or their children or their children's children, but somewhere along in a future generation, we would have played our part to ensure that that shift along the axis has taken place. So as long as we don't hope that it's going to be in our lifetime and die of disappointment, we have something to hope for. Every single one of us are important in this process of change, and it just takes time, but it cannot happen without us, and it can only happen if and it can happen faster if we do it together. And I think the climate crisis, is a challenge that confronts us in a very, very real way. And I'm hoping as we stand up and engage these realities, that we would be able to forge the unity required. And documents like the Climate Justice Charter, like our Constitution, like the Freedom Charter, and many, many other documents that speak to rights and putting people before profits will become the order of the day. I'm hopeful of that.
I believe we all share your hopes, Hamida, and I suppose in line with your inspirational message about us not feeling the world turn, I think one thing that hopefully our governments, but also people will feel, is that standstill you mentioned, and maybe that's something that we should work toward as the only route for us to finally bring about real change that people will feel. But I think less than pessimism, you just painted a real realistic interpretation of where we are right now. We are at a moment right now that is critical. We're at a moment right now where many people are suffering, and that's something we should never shy away from. Something we at the Climate Justice Charter Movement are not shying away from. And Hamida is 100% correct that this needs to move from just being a charter, it's being actual implementation, and that's going to take challenging and winning against our government, something we haven't done yet, but we need to keep pushing toward. Please continue to support the Climate Justice Charter movement. Follow us on social media. Please help us sign and share the petition and to start to build a larger movement. Hamida mentioned a bit about how some of our civil society movements are weaker now than we were in the past. We're working to address that, to become stronger as civil society, and then to start to move towards solving many of these issues. Thank you everyone for attending the webinar this evening, the sixth and last one in our series. You can find this one, which will be posted on the Cooperative Policy and Alternative Center YouTube channel. You can also find some of the previous episodes of our webinar. I just want to say thank you again, Hamida, for joining us this evening.
You're most welcome.
And thank you to everyone else who joined us this evening. I know the issues are quite disastrous, quite distraught. Many communities are, as we speak right now, still without water. But as Hamida said, let's continue fighting. And as long as we are alive in this generation, and it is our struggle, let's maintain hope. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night. Thank you very much. Cheers.